I want to start with a story. Lord Rothschild, Jacob Rothschild, went to dinner with the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, a few years ago. And at that dinner was Queen Sophia, and she was the guest of honor. And it was her request that all the people who were at that dinner might say what their favorite part, their favorite memory of Spain was. And when it came to Jacob Rothschild, he stood up and said, "There is a small part of the northeast of England which is a part of Spain, in Bishop Auckland, in Auckland Castle, and that is where my heart is." And it was a very gracious thing of him to say, because that captures exactly what I hope will be true one day, although when he spoke it, it was a hope, not a truth at all. We, the Auckland Castle Trust, has acquired Auckland Castle, which has within it 13 famous and wonderful pictures by Francisco de Zurbarán of Jacob and the 12 tribes of Israel. So you can see how suitable it was that Jacob Rothschild, who is himself Jewish and one of the great members of the British establishment, how appropriate it was that he was saying what he did in New York. And my challenge when I took on both the castle and the pictures was, how could we use these assets, this fine building and the fine pictures, to help to regenerate the area, which is very like Bilbao. It's a coal mining part of the world, but it has shipbuilding cities only a few miles away at the coast to the North Sea. And what I knew was that if I could use the Zurbarán pictures as a springboard, then it would be possible to be a part of Spain and to do something to help this part of the world. And my ambition was to create a Spanish gallery and to put alongside it a research institute, because this meeting here today is testimony to the fact that where there is great art, there needs too to be scholarship. Great art without scholarship loses its luster, and it hangs sadly on the walls. Scholarship without the art is an arid and tepid thing. But if you put them together, as you have seen here at the Prado, then everything sparkles. And the intention is that we will have a research institute specializing in Spanish art and Spanish culture and run by Durham University, with, we hope, a great first director, and that we will have a Spanish gallery which, although small, will have fine things in it. And one of the great encouragements that I have had is to have the full support of the Prado and indeed the Real Academia as well. And this evening I have been with Miguel Zucata and with Miguel Falomir, and I said I was going to talk just in general terms about what we might do together. And they said, no, tell the audience that we have a collaboration, and it will be a collaboration both of scholarship and of the lending of pictures. And of course the hope is that we will have from these two great institutions in Madrid pictures that can be researched by the Institute so that we can excite scholarship. Britain used to be at the very heart of Spanish picture and culture scholarship. But time goes on, and today we have to rebuild that. But that is my ambition. And why is it that I first looked at Auckland Castle and these pictures? And the reason is because the reason that these pictures came to Auckland Castle is itself an interesting one. They were the Prince Bishop of 1750, called Bishop Richard Trevor, was a grandee, and he was politically powerful, and he wanted to bring to England a law which would emancipate the Jews, give them the right to own property, to have wills, to do all the things that in society is necessary for a full part in life. And that bill became law, became an act of Parliament, and there was rioting in England. They couldn't cope with the idea. And so 6 months later, the bill was repealed. And Bishop Trevor bought these pictures of the 12 patriarchs of Israel, and he extended the grand dining room at Auckland. And whenever he had a grand dinner party, the grandees had to look at Reuben, had to look at Levi, had to look at Issachar. And this was his way of saying, see what you've done. And I look at the story which starts in the book of Genesis. That's when we learn about the patriarchs. And I see how over not so much the centuries, but the millennium, this story has had an effect on society. And the most recent effect, since the Age of Enlightenment, what we see is that the truths that you find in the sacred book have expression as social action. And that is what Bishop Trevor was doing in the 18th century, and what we hope to do today in an area of great deprivation and need. And the other aspect which we see in the way that we look at this Old Testament story is that we approach it in a way that never used to be the case, through science, through archaeology, through textual criticism. And these things were quite unknown, quite unthought about in the days when Zurbarán was painting his pictures. And I think of the story as being like an old gatepost, and that every so often a new coat of paint is put on that gatepost. So perhaps it started as quite a little one, and it's now, from all those coats of paint, really quite a big one. And so we're going to, this evening, roll back the paint and see what we started off with in that story and what it's become in Zurbarán's day and subsequently. And so we begin with the biblical text in the book of Genesis. It's chapter 49. And what we see is a story of a man who's featured before. He's a man with a past, Jacob, and he has 12 sons. And I think in today's sophisticated world, we forget what a remarkable thing it was to have 12 sons who came to adulthood. I'm told that, yes, I wouldn't want 12 sons either. I'm told that if that those who study the DNA of Europe can trace nearly everybody back to 6 women back in very early times. And so you can see, if that's true, how the human race was hanging by the merest thread. And so these 12 sons would have been a miracle. And what we see is the first coat of paint when the story is told, because this story goes right back to the Egyptian Hyksos period, but it's described in the Bible in the language of Moses. Yahweh appears. Now, the patriarchs had no idea of the God Yahweh. That came when God said to Moses, "I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, Lord God Almighty. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them." And when the narrative was being written, the heresy, I suppose you could call it, of Baal was prevalent. But the narrator tactfully didn't bring that subsequent development back. And so I think the earliest way we understand this story is to say that the story of the patriarchs is supra-historical. It's seen through the perspective of God and the balancing truth that the historic activity of those who were the players in the drama is crucially important. So that's how we have to understand the story. The story, as I say, was told in the book of Genesis, chapter 49, and they are known collectively as the blessings of Jacob. And they provide the foundation for Zurbarán's paintings at Auckland Castle. And we, I think, have a different idea of what the word blessing means. It can't be understood wholly as a beneficent act. The blessing on Reuben reads more like a lawsuit. And those on the next two, Simeon and Levi, like a condemnation and a curse. And theologians have cautiously approved the idea that how one might define a blessing, it's a magical, self-fulfilling thought, a power-loaded saying working out what it says. It looks backwards to the lives which each of the sons had lived, and forward in prophecy to their future lives and their position in posterity. So very suitable for Jacob, who was on a deathbed setting. And one of the things that we see in that is that it's not very clear who the king will be. We know that Jacob was effectively a king in Egypt, but he had no children. And Judah is described as having a scepter, and yet Reuben was the firstborn. And so from this early stage, there is ambivalence. We don't know quite what is going on. And those were the words which were written in the Bible. And what happened from the earliest days of Christianity was that these biblical passages were interpreted, and it transpired that chapter 49, the blessings of Jacob, were very fertile ground for the way that early Christian philosophers, theologians, thought about the Bible. The four Latin fathers, the doctors of divinity, established two ways of interpreting the Bible. It was to be studied in the literal sense, and it was also to be understood in a mystical or spiritual sense, which meant that further levels of meaning might be uncovered through figural or allegorical interpretation. And when you have something as ambiguous as the blessings of Jacob, that's a field day. The earliest of all the commentators was Hippolytus of Rome, who wrote an entire book about the blessings of Jacob, and it's so boring, I'm not even going to tell you what was in it. The next person who came was St. Ambrose, and he wrote a commentary on the life of Jacob when he focused on what he called the moral sense of Scripture, where he elucidates the relationship of Jacob and Jesus Christ. And he set out to show how the importance of self-control and right reason in overcoming temptations to sin were crucial to the Christian life. And he declared that to be the path of true happiness, and how Jacob and Joseph overcame their passions through self-restraint. St. Augustine took that a stage further and said that the New Testament lies hidden in the Old Testament, and the Old is fulfilled in the New. And so he set out to decode Scripture, and that it was from the beginning, it was part of God's plan, that by looking at the Old Testament, one might find eternal truths which made sense in a post-Christ world. The person who was probably the most important and certainly set the scene in a Spanish context was Isidore of Seville. This is a cavalry charge through names. We've still only got to the year 570 when he was born. But he was an important international scholar. And Spain kept his theology very much at the forefront through the shock of the Reformation and the fight back of the Counter-Reformation. And we certainly know that his writings were well known to Francisco Pacheco, Velázquez's father-in-law in Seville. He created what was effectively a handbook of scriptural allegories. It's hard to believe that that they lived in a world where such a thing might be a bestseller, but it was. And to give you an idea of what he wrote, he took both Esau and Jacob. And so in the contrast between Esau and Jacob, he said that Esau was a bad man, and that Jacob was a good man. And this is the sort of language that you can see that he used. The allegorical interpretation here talks, of course, about the story of Isaac, Jacob's father, giving the blessing to the wrong person. And of all the illustrations, I think the picture in the Prado by Ribera is one of the most telling. This tradition of taking allegory, taking the words and turning them into something else, was a very powerful movement back at the beginning of Christian theology in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century. But it rather ran out of steam as time went on. The last person in the tradition was Vilega Salvago, and his dates were 1534 to 1615. So we're not quite getting up to the date of Zurbrun. Zurbrun was born in 1598. These pictures were 1640. But what we're finding is that this allegorical tradition, which had been so firmly in place for 1,000 years, was running out of steam. And the baton, if you like, was passed from the theologians, from serious thought, into popular religious dramas. And so Diego Sanchez de Badajoz was one of the the first to do this. And it looks as though they were created for the feast of Corpus Christi. And there's a bound book which I think is in the Biblioteca Nacional, which has no less than 96 of these sacred dramas. And these follow the tradition that the great theologians had followed. And Lope de Vega, the much more important playwright, he incorporated them into some of his plays. And they also went down market as well. And Miquel de Calavar, I don't think I pronounced him right, wrote a rather scurrilous play for Corpus Christi, which involved Potiphar trying to seduce Joseph, and I gather it went rather further down the literal road than perhaps it should have done. But what we're seeing here is a tradition that is running out of steam just at the time that Zurbarán was beginning to paint. And there was one other way in which the tradition that Bible stories were being understood, and that was from writings, medieval writings of books, which were fanciful inventions around Bible people. The most common one is the Golden Legend, and many of you will know that a lot of subsequent painting are themes taken from the Golden Legend. But there was another apocryphal scripture known as the Testament of the 12 tribes of Israel. And these enjoyed enormous popularity in Northern Europe during the 16th and 17th century. The one on the screen at the moment was English, dated 1581. It wasn't translated into Spanish, but I'm reliably informed it was translated into Welsh, which I think you'll agree is a pretty important thing if you're Welsh and interested in the blessings of Jacob. But what the Testaments did was to record the last words of the sons of Jacob. Each patriarch tells his own story, and sharing the experience with the family members surrounding the deathbed. And so what we see is each of them with having different stories. And this is basically the source from which Zurbarán took his paintings. So it's this tradition which gives us the clue to what Zurbarán was trying to do. And we can see as we go through that each of them had particular characteristics. And the influence of this book and these illustrations, which were made as woodcuts, was pretty powerful, and certainly it was known in Spain. What we've been looking at are illustrations by Joost Lambrecht, who died about 50 years before Zurbarán was born. And this prompted a production of a number of print series depicting the 12 tribes of Israel, mostly in the Low Countries. And the first serious one was by Van Heemskerk. And you can see from the picture on the screen that we're looking at something that is quite a lot more sophisticated than we saw on the original woodcuts. Each of the sons of Jacob is a nude or semi-nude figure, and each is accompanied by both an animal and a sculpture of a classical god. And these strange, even cryptic additions have moved a long way from the biblical text, but they have their being through the Testament and the original illustrations of them. One of the things which we have always imagined was that until the last century, with Chagall and Picasso, who did prints of the 12 patriarchs, that going back to earlier times, the work of Zurbaran was unique in producing a set of pictures. But we have discovered a further series of life-size painted depictions of Jacob and his 12 sons, and we have acquired them for Auckland Castle. And it's clear from these that they too are intimately connected with the testament of the patriarchs. And I thought we might have a cavalry charge through them so that we can see that they employ the same symbolic language as the woodcuts of Lambrecht and the more sophisticated etchings of Van Heemskerk. And each composition features a classical god or an allegorical personification. So what we're looking at on the screen is Jacob and a little dog. And while I think he looks pretty well on the left, he's clearly slowing down a bit on the right. But we'll go through just 4 or 5 of this series, because these are, although they come from a quite different part of Europe, these are so absolutely in the tradition of the Zurbaran pictures, and this connection has never been made before. So if we look at Simeon, the words at the bottom say, "O Levi and Simeon, fearsome brotherhood, what have I to do with you, you blood-shedding band?" In the Bible, they were condemned by their father for avenging the rape of their sister by killing all the men in the province of Shechem. And Lambrecht's woodcut shows Simeon wearing a helmet with a sword raised above his head. And the wolf, which is that rather sweet thing on the right, becomes a cat with Van Heemskerk. Quite an aggressive cat in Van Heemskerk, but it's definitely been more domesticated by the time we get to Simeon. And on the top corner, we have a miniature figure of a woman biting a heart, which is the allegorical personification of envy. Those of you who study these things will know Cesare Ripa's work of about 20 years later, but this shows all the hallmarks of envy, and that was regarded as his great sin. Moving on to Levi, little is said in the Bible, but he was became the tribe chosen by God to serve as nomadic priests to the Israelites. And the flaming sword and the unique headgear displaying the crescent moon and the concentric circles of light in the upper corner suggest the idea that God is revealing mysteries to Levi. And the bear is a symbol of rage, although it might look more like a migraine to modernize. Gad is the next one. Gad the magnanimous shall enter into fierce battles, and he is shown in the Lambrecht as in the exact language of the Testaments. He killed, I kept the flocks by night, and when there came any lion, leopard, wolf, or bear, or other wild beasts upon our cattle, I pursued it. I seized its foot with my hand and hurled it about a stone's throw, and so killed it. And since Heemskirk had allocated the lion and the wolf and the bear to other patriarchs, Gad gets the leopard. And again, we have a wild cat sitting by Gad, patiently behind Gad's legs, and Mars, the god of war, is the completion of that painted composition. The last one is Asher, and he was the producer of food. I have my doubts as to whether that would get a Michelin star today, but if one looks at the Heemskirk and the Lambrecht, you'll see that the goddess Ceres in the Heemskirk bottom left, and also in the top left, there she is with lots of calories. And let's do Naphtali very quickly. He has a stag as his building, as his animal. There, in each of the three of them, the same thing. So I've taken a bit of time to go through those pictures, but they are very important in the story of these Zurbarans, and we came across them quite by chance. But this set probably tells us more than anything else about what was going through Zurbaran's mind when he painted them. Zurbaran himself had a rather haphazard way of creating portraiture. On his death, he had 74 Dutch and Flemish prints. And what he simply did was he filched ideas from them. So here you can see the character taken straight out of the Van Heemskerk print of Tamar and Amnon. If we go on to the next one, a fair bit of work has been done in trying to nail where Zurbaran took his images from. And Gad was always a mystery. Nobody knew where that came from. And in fact, it comes from one of the most famous of all 16th century prints by Hendrik Holtzius. He's been scrubbed up a bit for his appearance as a patriarch, but you can see that in every characteristic, that's where he came from. And if we could go on to the next one, here is Judah, taken from Jacob de Gain, who was Holtzius's pupil. And the next one. Here we put this one in again. This is Dan again. The Asher, the idea taken from the bread of another de Gain, and one that's very close, the Zebulun, the anchor, that rather sexy hat, and the way he holds his head is clearly taken from the Gain as well. Here the wolf is taken. The set of Zurbaran that we have at the castle actually isn't a complete set, because Bishop Trevor couldn't afford Benjamin. They came up at auction one by one, and he spent more on Jacob and the first 11 than he could afford. So the Duke of Ancaster bought the last one, but he got somebody called Arthur Pond to do a copy of it. And what you're looking at here is the Arthur Pond copy. We know the owner of the original, and she's very kindly going to lend us the original. She has a very fine Vanbrugh chapel, and that's where Benjamin normally resides. What I would like to turn to now, if I can find my place, is the way in which painters painted after the ructions of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent was an important element in the way that the papacy tried to control what happened oil on canvas. And Carlo Borromeo said that any sacred image had to be approved by ecclesiastical authority. And one of the things I'd like to do quickly is to take the story of Jacob's dream as to how it was painted over a period of time. And you remember the story. Jacob fell asleep and had a dream, and he saw angels walking up and down, descending from heaven and ascending to heaven. And before the papacy really got its way, we had, this is Vasari, the great writer, a typical mannerist painting where there's no reality. Everything is still bathed in the language of allegory. And that gave way before, by the end of the 16th century, to a much simpler way of looking at things. This is a Cigoli, which is, there are a number of versions, and we have one of them, this particular one, at Auckland Castle. And the reason I wanted to show this one is because you can see from this next slide how much Cigoli thought as those early theologians does. On the right is a red chalk drawing in the Uffizi of the dead Christ. You can see the stigmata, but that is exactly the same person and the same pose as Jacob, asleep and dreaming. And there, that wouldn't have been in any way an odd thing at that venture, because, of course, Jacob was the antitype of Christ himself. And when the Council of Trent affirmed the power of art to move the people who were looking at, it took them a generation to work out how to achieve that. And if we look at a picture that is extremely well known to us here of Ribera, what you can see is that it has become something that we as ordinary people can identify with much more closely than before. And if you contrast it with Murillo, a few years later, the dream has become tactile. You feel that the angels up and down and Jacob are really one and the same thing. Now, the truth of this is that there are lots of pictures of Jacob's dream, because that works pictorially, but precious few sets of the patriarch, because they don't work so well. And I want to spend a few minutes just addressing who was it that Zurbrun uniquely painted these pictures for. He was quite a dab at painting sets, as we'll see in due course. But these pictures were painted for a particular reason. Spain had captured a century earlier the most of South America and Mexico, and there were many missionaries who were converting local indigenous people to Christianity. But the theological difficulty was around what was the status of these people who were converted, because Christ says that every person who becomes regenerate, becomes a Christian, is a child of Israel. And they couldn't work out how people in South America could possibly be children of Israel, Israel being another name for Jacob. And so they came to the conclusion that if there were as many as 12 brothers jostling about, surely there was a diaspora, and at least one of them, and probably more, would have gone to South America. And so the theories started, and they were legendary lost tribes following the invasion of King Shalmaneser. Well, that didn't really catch fire. And there was a Dominican missionary who thought that something like this must have happened. But the person who was the most certain of what had happened was actually a Jewish person called Antonio Montesino, who reported that he discovered the lost tribe of Reuben living in the Americas. And this account was published in Latin and Spanish by Manasseh ben Israel. And it's funny, isn't it, how historical events come together, because one of the great acts of Oliver Cromwell in the English Civil War was to invite Jews to come to England, because Cromwell believed that in the last days before Christ came back to earth, the Jews would all be converted to Christianity. So he felt it would be quite a nice idea if there were as many as possible round and about. And given that it was the Civil War which changed the whole course of Auckland Castle, it feels rather an odd thing to be talking about Zurbaran, South America, Oliver Cromwell, and Auckland Castle. But the reason this looks like it's probably true is because there are poor copies of the sets of the patriarchs, Zurbaran's patriarchs, in South America. There are some in Mexico. Here's one. It's definitely any other leading brand, isn't it? But it's clearly there in South America for a reason, and surely for this reason. So we come to the question, why did Zurbaran paint these pictures? Now, I think the answer is indeed hinted at in the fact that they are a set. And this is a man who specialized in producing cycles of full-length apostolados, virgin martyrs, and founders of religious orders for influential ecclesiastical patrons. Here is the Convent of Sinclair in Carmona, and you can see that there that they were meant, you see the same in the Guadalupe set, that they were meant to be looked up to high in a cathedral or a public building. And of course, in the domestic setting of Auckland Castle, they're completely hung in the wrong place. But I feel that 250 years of tradition of hanging in a carpeted and flock-walled palace gives them an authority which perhaps they didn't have in the early days. Gabriele Finaldi has been an important person in this working out what happened. And one of the rather interesting things which shows how little knowledge can travel is that although these were famous pictures in the north of England, it wasn't until 1936 that Spanish scholarship picked up that they existed. And they're now quite well known because Finaldi, when he was first working in the National Gallery under Neil MacGregor, he organized that they come first to the National Gallery and then the Prado. And it was he who said, it was entirely characteristic of him that he should have had the thought of the subject of the 12 patriarchs as the Old Testament equivalent of an apostolado, the traditional serial representation of the apostles. Such a pairing strikes to the heart of the way that those early theologians interpreted Old Testament scripture. And by choosing this format, it would appear that Zurbaran was thinking exactly the same thing. What we can see is that from the animals that accompanied the pictures, Zurbaran was looking at this apocryphal work which we have seen develop. But by isolating each individual within a frame and with this impressive size of the paintings themselves with their low horizons, it gives a great power to them. It's quite difficult in illustration to give a feel for what they look like. But actually, thanks to the size of the image on the screen, I think this is the next best thing. If you come to Auckland Castle and you pay me about €5, then you can actually see the original. So I would commend that to you. And if you're over 90 years old or under 3, I think you get in for free. So that's the possibility. But that is the story that I have to tell. Thank you for listening patiently. And I repeat again that I hope Nuria said nice things about me.